Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today we're fortunate to have as our guest Lisa Crossman. Lisa serves as the curator at the Fitchburg Art Museum, and she also curated the current fascinating exhibition entitled The Sacred in the Profane, which is on display at the Museum of Russian Icons, located in Clinton, now through June 30th. This exhibition features the unique work of well-known Russian sculptor Konstantin Simun. During the program, we're finding out why and how the sacred and the profane came about. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate Mr. Simun's background, his work as a sculptor, and the wonderful opportunity those of you watching have to visit the exhibition. Let's start by meeting Lisa and then finding out all about the sacred and the profane. Welcome, Lisa. Delighted to see you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Jay.
I had a fabulous visit, eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear that.
A couple of weeks ago, so eager to hear more and definitely have you inform viewers. But before we jump to that, I think it would be of interest just to hear a little bit about your background and current position at the Fitchburg Art Museum.
Yes, so my background is actually in modern and contemporary Latin American art. It's what I did my doctoral work in. And I taught some, held some other positions, and I've been at the Fitchburg Art Museum now almost 3 years. And it's been really wonderful to be a curator at the Fitchburg Art Museum, working mainly with contemporary artists based in New England, as well as with work in our collection, photography and American art mainly.
And then how did the collaboration, before we even get to the exhibition, how did the collaboration with the Museum of Russian Icons come about?
Yes, well, interestingly, Kent Russell worked at the Fitchburg Art Museum years ago. He is now the director of the Museum of Russian Icons. And so I met Kent on a visit to the Museum of Russian Icons, my first visit, and the two of us with Nick Capasso, the director of the Fitchburg Art Museum, began to hatch a plan to build a collaboration. And I will leave the planning of the collaboration really to the directors. They really ironed out a wonderful plan to create a series of exhibitions over the next 3 years that will bring contemporary art to the special exhibition gallery at the Museum of Russian Icons. And so each of these exhibitions will include work that will be either about Russia or by Russian artists, at times specifically touching on certain aspects of the icon tradition. And so we began the series with the work of Konstantin, which I think is a really excellent fit for the Museum of Russian
that's
Icons.
wonderful to hear that this isn't just a one-shot exhibition, that the collaboration will be going on, because when we get into it and people will see it soon, it's not something you would at first think fits, but then the more you think about it and learn about Konstantin and his work, it's a wonderful fit, and to make it contemporary is a nice change for sure, addition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been wonderful. It's really important to think about the contemporary context in relation to history, I think, right? And I've loved the opportunities as a curator when you can really sort of draw those connections for viewers. It's such an amazing learning opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, to give a little context to what we're going to see, would you provide a little background to Konstantin?
Yes, of course.
And then we'll move on.
Yeah, so Konstantin was born in Russia, in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in the 1930s. He studied art in the 1950s. So, you know, in the 1950s, there was a slightly loosening up of communism, post-Stalin, right? And so before that, you had, you know, a real emphasis on socialist realism, and then it sort of shifts slightly. So there's a little bit more exposure to modernism, and I'm saying this because I think this is important to think about when you're thinking about Konstantin's work, that he was in this environment. But in Russia, there also wasn't a lot of consumer goods. So this is sort of, these are all things that were sort of part of his initiation as an artist, I suppose. But he was academically trained as a sculptor, and we can see Konstantin Simun here. And he moved to the US in the 1980s and 1988, really for personal reasons, and became enthralled with plastic and just the amount of plastic in mass-produced consumable goods that you find in the United States. And he just started collecting these pieces and started to see imagery that we can recognize as Christian iconography in these pieces, and to think about maybe the meanings that we attach to consumable goods, and also just the vessel as an object, you know, which this is a contemporary in a contemporary context that will explore the plastic vessel. But you can think back to ancient times. There have been vessels with faces and in various anthropomorphic representations for a long time.
Just to again provide a little more background to him before we jump to the current exhibition, we just want to highlight a couple of his works before. This one got a lot of well-known recognition, The Broken Ring. Just a quick word, please, about this one.
Sure. The Broken Ring is one of, as you mentioned, Jay, it's one of Konstantin's most well-known works. So it's a monument to the siege that happened in Leningrad during World War II. So the monument is located on Lake Ladoga, and it's basically two arches, and as you can see in the image, there's a break between the two of them. So it's really referencing sort of the ice path that was built across the lake to bring materials in and also to evacuate people. And so it's a really profound statement, and it's also a very interesting monument in that it is abstract, right? So it's an abstract symbol that's used to sort of talk about and memorialize the siege. And so it's very powerful, and it definitely is his most well-known work, and I think is important just to keep in mind as we move forward, as he shifts gears towards plastic. But I think that the sort of monumentality that you see here can be reinterpreted, or you can be used as a frame to think about other pieces that he produces.
And he was recognized with the highly esteemed Lenin Prize for this piece of work. Well, making the transition, you have a wonderful picture or two there of something that was at the Decorative Museum for a decade or so.
Yep, exactly. So what you see here in this book of Konstantin's work is an image of a totem. It's America totem, I believe it's called, Totem America, and it was in the 1990s that it was created at the Decorative Museum, as you stated, and remained outside as part of the sculpture park for about a decade. And as you can see here, it's really an accumulation of found plastic. And I think that you can read a lot into this artwork because of its title and because it is a tower of plastic in terms of maybe what we value in the U.S. He tends to not talk about his work as to write particular social meanings onto it, but I think that it definitely is wide open to various interpretations.
Most definitely, most definitely. Well, moving on to the sacred and the profane, a little bit more on how it came together and the mission and purpose that you had in mind.
Absolutely. So I will say first that I learned about Konstantin's work through Nick Capasso and his work with Konstantin at the Decorative Museum. And Nick and Kent and I all agreed that it was a great place, a great first exhibition to have at the Museum of Russian Icons for a variety of reasons. And one of them, which will include some backstory about the Museum of Russian Icons too, is the fact that Gordon Langton, the founder of the Museum of Russian Icons, actually worked in plastic. So he worked with Nipro as the CEO of Nipro, and he became incredibly fascinated with Russian icons on a business trip in the 1980s. which is a very interesting parallel story to what happened with Konstantin, who, you know, had been working in Russia, came to the US in the 1980s, and then became fascinated with plastic. And both of them kind of became connoisseurs and collectors, one of Russian icons, the other of plastics. And so I think that story is really fascinating, and it's wonderful to be able to bring it together. And in Konstantin's work, I think that you can see how some of the icon tradition is sort of part of his vocabulary, right? So you can see certain elements like gilding to sort of signal that it's something ethereal, right? He definitely is not making icons per se, but he is referencing certain aspects of them, such as maybe the flat surface, the use of non-illusionistic space, some references like to the Madonna, so to Christian iconography, right? But doing this really through found materials, so the plastic bottle is the main feature, and then sometimes, well, he uses a variety of materials that I show in the that are represented in the show, but the bottle sort of is the main subject, I would say.
Before we step right in, this is a wonderful overview of the exhibition. For those who haven't had the chance to visit yet, could you just give us a quick sense of your thinking and organizing it this way?
Yeah, so while putting this show together, I thought a lot about its placement in the Museum of Russian Icons. I think this is work that is different for the standard viewer at the Museum of Russian Icons. So I really wanted to think about sort of how to bridge those two different worlds of the icons that are represented in contemporary art. And one way that I thought about doing this was to really make sure that I showed a variety of materials, because Konstantin worked with a lot of found plastic, but he also worked in more traditional materials, such as bronze. He's worked with wood. He's worked with silver, so there are these beautiful pieces of jewelry that are included in the exhibition. He's worked with ceramics. So I think that all of these more traditional sort of materials help to sort of show his method of working, his talent as a sculptor, but also sort of elevate maybe the plastic and allow people to sort of understand what he was trying to do with it. And so I hope to achieve that, and I really didn't want to have too many pieces. I think that instead of giving a lot of material for people to look at, I wanted to minimize it so that people could really sort of sit with each piece for a while, because I think that if you walk quickly past, you might miss what Konstantin is truly after. And I think that with fewer works, you can really reflect and start to notice the nuances of what he's doing, sometimes with something as simple as flipping the orientation and adding, juxtaposing different pieces together.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that aspect of the exhibition, both how it's spaced out, somewhat limited, so I didn't feel overwhelmed. I was almost relieved when I started out, because, as you say, it allows you to just enjoy each piece and not feel like you have to keep going through and do a quick take on so many more.
And it also really sets itself apart from the rest of the Museum of Russian Icons, which it's actually quite dense.
That's right.
And there's a lot of material to look at, so I just wanted it to be very clear that you were walking into a space that was of contemporary art, that was that's separate, you know.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in. We have a couple of shots of this first one, the Scream. A little bit background and materials and what we're seeing.
Absolutely. So you see a bronze piece up on the screen, Jay, and it's Scream, but in parentheses, it's self-portraits from the 1990s. And it is an earlier piece, so the work represented in the show spans from the mid-1980s through the 2000s. So it captures like a spectrum of his work, 80s to 2000s. And in this piece, I wanted it to be an opener, one, because there's a reference to it being a self-portrait, which I think is a nice starter to the exhibition. You can also see the reference to plastic in this piece as well, to the general form and that merging, that sort of association that Konstantin makes between sort of the human form and form of plastic. And it's very evocative. It's made in a traditional material, which again, I thought that was like a nice access point. And I think it's really open to interpretation. So I can read in various things into this piece. Konstantin, as I said, tends to sort of like let viewers interpret as they will. But I think that this one is great, and it also has that, as you can see when you sort of look inside, it has this kind of like glow and this kind of illumination that comes out of it, which I think is pretty spectacular.
Really wonderful way to begin. And moving on, we have a couple of shots of this. What are we seeing here, please?
Yep, so this is Portrait of a Man, and this is a ceramic piece that Konstantin created, and so again, he worked across various materials, and even though this is in ceramic, you can still see that it's referencing a bottle, right? It's just oriented in a different direction. And I really love the conversation that happens between his use of material, so that when you see plastic, you are perhaps so used to seeing plastic that maybe you miss some of the associations that he's making, right? Whereas if you see it in a different material, then perhaps you see less of the plastic and you can see more of the human form. And I think with the ceramic in particular, that makes a really sort of beautiful connection back to ancient types of vessels that were created, right? Often in ceramics, right? That reference the human form, be it the face or the body.
Yeah, and I was struck too with the background that you provided about Konstantin in the Soviet Union and the lack of consumable goods, and then his sort of take and reaction to being placed in this setting.
Yeah, I think he was really overwhelmed, but also found plastic to be beautiful in a way, and so he often will say, "Trash or treasure?" You know, what is it? And is definitely working within a long tradition of modern and contemporary art practice, in which artists are sort of taking materials of everyday use and pulling them into art making to allow us to sort of explore various meanings behind them, some of them embedded in maybe how they function in society, and then also maybe making different connections that span the current context as well, which I think happens with his work.
And this next one gets at another point you mentioned, that some of them have religious connotation, this one being the Madonna.
Yep. So yeah, I think, I don't know, Jay, would you recognize this as a Madonna if it didn't have the title?
Maybe knowing the context of where it's being placed, I could definitely see that. Because once you have that hint, it's quite noticeable, I think.
I think so too, and I think that's something that's beautiful. Like the more that you sit with the piece, right, the more that you start to see these associations. So this is Madonna, and you can see sort of the gold that is around the two kind of heads, which are actually the plastic bottles that are clear plastic, right? So they have a slight glow to them. And then as you look at it, you can see that the form around it becomes this kind of halo, right? You could associate the two different heads as Madonnas, as Madonna and Child. You can, it sort of opens it up to iconography that that is very familiar and is sort of for many people who are Christian, it's very familiar imagery, right?
Most definitely.
So I think that it's a subtle play to a degree, but once you start seeing it, it's very pronounced and evident.
No, I think if you had one of the icons there from the museum, it would be striking.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's also worth mentioning again that Konstantin is not trying to replicate an icon, right?
Right.
He's not trying to create something that is a religious object, that he is a sculptor, that he works in contemporary art, and that he's playing with different forms that we venerate, and exploring sort of how that can play out, and what that means socially and in religion, I think, as well, in an abstract way.
Well, this next one doesn't have quite the same context.
Sure.
I think once you're given the title, in this case Pharaoh, you can definitely see the connection.
Yeah, so this is a great detail, and I also like that you include this piece because sometimes he's working with a smaller kind of jug, right? And sometimes he's working with much larger pieces of plastic that he's found. So this is one large blue form made out of molded plastic. And you can sort of, you've zeroed in on the face, which is very animated, and maybe you can connect that back out to Scream. But again, sort of giving sort of this totem-like form sort of a sacred meaning. And, you know, to go back to the title, I think that he is elevating these objects, right, in a way, and giving them sort of more symbolic content. And which is something that we very easily could miss, and we do miss when they're sort of in mass quantities throughout our life.
Definitely, most definitely.
But forms that are mass produced and forms that we create, just everyday objects, those shapes come from somewhere, right? And I think that Konstantin is very much thinking about sort of these ingrained ideas, like we have these archetypes, these basic forms that are in the background of our thinking and our knowledge, and that when we create things, even if we're making just profane functional objects, that they often are in the shape of ourselves and our history, right? And
I think that really comes through in his work. While he might not have as a ultimate goal the social commentary, to raise our consciousness to the everyday is definitely accomplished.
Absolutely.
And a couple of images of this Totem America too.
So we have this other version of Totem America, right? And we have Totem America 2, which is smaller. And I think this piece is interesting because in some ways there's a play between this one and other ones that you see in the show. But I think that this one does ask the question of social content and what do we value as Americans, and how does plastic fit into this? And so I think that these are the types of questions that one could certainly ask, and I think that Konstantin does this in kind of a playful way, and in particular when he talks about it, I think that he's leaving it up for us to sort of look at it and think and decide.
Yeah, no, that's appreciated. This one has some wonderful images, one that people might remember from the initial shot and the background, and then a nice close-up.
Yeah, so this piece on the beach comes in two parts. And I will say that Konstantin was very wonderful to work with, and he insisted on one thing as soon as we started, and the one thing that he really wanted was to have this blown-up image of On the Beach, which is what you see here, and to connect that with one of the actual bottles. And that serves as a really nice anchor to the show, actually, because as soon as you walk in, if you think back to the installation shot, you have that large blown up image that sits between the two windows, which is of this, right?
Right.
And then kind of in front of that, you have a case that has kinetic sand, and it has this bottle, slightly faded. It's a Tide bottle, I think, positioned in the sand. And I love the conversation that happens between the two, this kind of replica that you see of the form. And I also think that it emphasizes kind of the found nature of the objects. But then also, I mean, by extension, you could read many other things into
I like
its
how you've
placement
situated
with water
it too, because we see the smaller version right in the middle of the room, which leads to the back and the larger image, so you can go back and forth and make a connection.
Yeah, and I mean, the replication of form is definitely an important aspect of his process and thinking, because he's working with molded plastic, he's working with forms that, or imagery that we've seen replicated, which I think is also an interesting tie to the icon tradition, actually, in that the icon tradition is based on very set rules. And so Konstantin perhaps does not have the same rigid rules that he follows, but he definitely is working within a certain vocabulary, and the molded plastic forms that he is finding and using in much of his work, or replicating through in different materials, is based on sort of a set form, on a set plan.
How did briefly the collaboration work between yourself and Konstantin?
Yeah, basically I went out to meet Konstantin, have that been almost a year? I think about a year ago. And we just had several visits. So he has a lot of his work at his home, and he lives in the greater Boston area. And so I had a chance to meet him. I've also had a chance to meet his family members who've acted at certain points to help with translation. I do not speak Russian, unfortunately, so that was very nice. But it's been wonderful, just because I have had many occasions to sort of sit with Konstantin and talk with him and look through his work. It was great to have Nick as someone who had worked with him at an earlier stage in his career as well, and Kent, who and his staff, who are very familiar with their audience, and with very knowledgeable of Russian icons, obviously, which I am a bit less knowledgeable. Much less knowledgeable, I will say. So it's been a learning experience for me as well. And I would say that, you know, Konstantin was very excited about this exhibition, was very pleased to have it at the Museum of Russian Icons, and was open and collaborative, and it was great.
I like how you included at the very end a section asking the visitors to give their impressions of the exhibition. Does it make sense? How were you experiencing it? And they write a comment or two and then post it on a bulletin board that's there as a nice engagement.
Yeah, so this is thanks to the education director of the Museum of Russian Icons. They have that space at the back of the gallery that you're talking about as kind of what we at the Fitchburg Art Museum call learning lounges, right? Which are areas of kind of engagement, and sometimes that can mean like a space where you can touch objects, or you can learn about process, or you can reflect on what you've seen. And I think that it is amazing to have that space, because I think that exhibitions bring up various, are a cause for reflection, right? And sometimes it is great to be able to share that and leave your comment behind, so other people can pick it up as a point to jump off.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up right now. It's been fascinating to learn more about the exhibition, about Konstantin. Definitely encourage people to make their way out to the Museum of Russian Icons up until the end of June. So lots of time to get out there.
Lots of time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jay. It was a real pleasure.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us, and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.